we were talking earlier on about Rishi Sunak's comments today on lockdown, on the sage scientists, on the way that the pandemic played out politically, I guess. And George, you know, is this a man pressing the big red button because he knows he's not going to win and maybe he might not be around in politics for much longer?
Well, I think Rishi Sunak was being honest about what he genuinely thought. We knew that he was one of the more sceptical of the cabinet on lockdown. I don't think it will dramatically change the state of the race. I think the problem for him is that it makes him look weak, potentially, that he failed to persuade other cabinet ministers, most obviously Boris Johnson, of his view, or cowardly, that he didn't resign and dissent in public. And I think it's also very easy to say, with hindsight, parts of lockdown went too far. What it's hardest to do is to have come up with an alternative. And I think in the interview, he was less strong on what he would have done differently than on how you could have had a more nuanced debate.
Yeah, Bim, I want to come to you on this because one of the things that Rishi Sunak pulled out was that the government didn't have a grown-up conversation with the public because it didn't give people the full picture. You know, looking back on it, reflecting, do you agree with him on that point?
Yes, I do. And at the time, I think it's important that we separate out two different phases. We had the initial sort of panic phase, and not just in Britain, but across the world. There was an initial panic phase of a couple of months. But then there was a later phase in the autumn. And in the first phase, it was a really tough situation for every single leader across the world. And I think that the government did what it felt it needed to do, indeed what the public was clamouring for it to do. But actually, as things went on through that summer and in the autumn, I think actually it's a bit less, I'm a bit less forgiving at that stage. And Rishi was very open with many people in private about his view on this. Many Conservative MPs were also very nervous about the road that we were going down. I think it's fair, as an MP at the time who voted for the measures that were put through, I think it's fair to say that maybe I myself and many others should have been more courageous at the time and said to the public what we were thinking, which is, particularly when you're dealing with young people missing school, and we're going to see the consequences of this for years, maybe we should have taken a different approach.
That's fascinating, Bim. So you think people should have been braver? I mean, Grace...
Yeah, and by the way, I include myself in that. I'm not, I take my own responsibility.
No, that's why I think it's really interesting to hear a politician saying that. And Grace, is this politics...
that means I've said something probably career.
No, it's a good thing, Bim. Grace, is this politics from Rishi Sunak, or is this actually a worrying reflection of how government failed during the pandemic?
So I think, the reason that he's making these remarks is, despite all available evidence, I don't think Team Rishi actually believes this race is fully over, and saying things about how lockdown was bad, verging on COVID denialism is something that is occasionally quite popular with a lot of the Conservative base as well. The issue is, I think it's very easy to forget this, the reason that we had the measures that were put in place was not simply because there was an effort to kind of completely halt the pandemic altogether. It was because of the strains that would have been put on the NHS, had loads and loads of people come down with COVID at the same time and ended up having to go to hospital and into ICU. And we did see that on multiple occasions. And indeed, we saw it fairly recently when, and we will probably see it again, as you have the kind of seasonal increases in the number of infections. Now, of course, there are always trade-offs, and the point that Ben was making about how people have had to miss school and the consequence of that will be very severe is true. The issue is that, the government knew where we were when it came to the pandemic, at mid-2020, let's say. Rather than kind of failing to really invest in prevention, they should have put much more money into the NHS, much more resource into the NHS, so that by the time of the second and third lockdowns, we weren't in a situation where there was so much strain in those systems. And indeed, today, we're still in a situation where there's so much strain in those systems and non-urgent operations being put off, which means lots of people actually dying because they haven't been able to have treatment.
Yeah, George, this is a good point, isn't it? Because what Grace is saying is the original argument was the NHS would be overwhelmed. But let's face facts, the NHS is overwhelmed right now. I mean, is this an argument that we could see politicians making about other things? Maybe don't go to hospital if you've got this, try and deal with this at home. I mean, is that the way that this is going?
Well, I think had we not had the lockdowns, I think the NHS would have been in an even bigger crisis that it was during the pandemic. I think the critique you can make is that the lockdowns we had were too late, actually, and chaotic, and that if you look at countries which had earlier lockdowns, it often meant that they could unlock earlier and get back to normal. So actually, I think that's for me, that's a more convincing critique of the government than Rishi Sunak's. In terms of the situation now, I think unless politicians are willing to invest more in public services, then their care will be rationed, and people are already giving up on trying to book a GP appointment, in some cases going private, if they can afford to do so, which obviously a lot of people can't. And so that's the reality, and that we talk about how inflation erodes people's pay and living standards, but it also erodes public service funding. So unless politicians are willing to fill the gap, then services are really going to hit crunch point, particularly the NHS in winter, when demand is at its greatest.
Yeah, and Ben, that's an important point, isn't it? We are coming up on winter. Things are going to get even more difficult. Would a Liz Truss government, potentially the most likely next Prime Minister, spend big on the health system?
So I want to take on two things that George said, and I deeply respect him and his work. The first is the idea that locking down earlier would have meant, it would have all been better. Actually, we came out of this crisis largely as a result of what we did on the vaccine, faster and more sustainably than most countries. The second point around spending money on the NHS. Now, look, I'm son of an NHS doctor. My mum's a pharmacist. I'm almost sounding like Rishi Sunak. But I said that a few times. No, it is clear that the NHS, in many respects, needs more funding. But what is also clear is if you look at the comparison of developed countries on the percentage of spending to GDP that the NHS has, we're actually at about 12%. We're relatively high. The problems in the NHS are structural. They're to do with not the way how primary care is set up, the way how A&E is set up, the fact that we need more private involvement in some areas and less in other areas. We need to look at this in a very fundamental, serious way. And I am frustrated, and speaking to many of my colleagues, we all know this to be true. And when we speak seriously amongst Conservative MPs, a lot of people will say, look, we do need to do these things, but it's politically incredibly difficult to say to the public that you have to change the NHS because you get accused by people. I mean, obviously not people like Grace and George because they're very sensible, but you might get accused from people on the left of, oh, you're going to privatise the NHS and all the rest of it. And political reality has meant that has stopped conservative, sensible, moderate, pragmatic reform happening.